ahead and make some announcements and then introduce our speaker. So the first announcement that we need to make is next week's seminar is canceled. So don't show up. We won't be here. We'll see you in 2 weeks. And as a reminder for today's seminar, to make sure that you put your questions in the Q&A instead of the chat function, so that we can see your questions and maintain the Q&A after Megan is finished speaking, right? So today we're excited to welcome our very own Megan Romanelli. Yeah, got it. Professor Romanelli joined the School of Social Work in 2020 as an assistant professor. Her research has focused on mental health disparities across various communities. She is here to talk about her work titled Utilizing Population-Based Data in Adolescent Suicide Research. So I'll hand it off to Megan to tell us about your work.
Unmute myself first and share my screen. Okay. Let me do some organizing of the screen too. Okay, so for the first time ever, I'm using 2 different screens. So I apologize if I have to pivot my head back and forth. Like Peter said, my name is Megan Romanelli, and I'm so grateful to be here with you this afternoon. I'm from the School of Social Work, and today I will be presenting findings from 2 different studies this afternoon and discussing utilizing population-based data in the context of adolescent suicide research. So just a brief overview for today's presentation. I'll start with some background on the prevalence of youth suicide. I'll touch upon theories that framed these studies and the research questions for each of the studies, review the methods for the studies, as well as the larger data set, which was the YRBS that we used, review the results of the studies, as well as the larger implications of the research. And then we will have some time for questions. Okay, so let us get into it. Okay, so suicide is the second leading cause of death among adolescents in the US. And there are an average of about 3,703 attempts by youth in grades 9 through 12 every single day. And it's important to note that that number would be even higher if it were to include youth in grades 7 through 8. So youth even just a little bit younger than in high school. And we're also seeing some signs that the trends of suicide risks among adolescents are increasing. So for example, from 2019 through 2020, there was a 31% increase in mental health related emergency department visits among adolescents. And we also know that the rates of suicide attempts are increasing specifically among particular groups of adolescents. So for example, among Black adolescents, and some research published by one of my mentors and also co-authors on both of the papers that I'll present today, Dr. Michael Lindsay, showed that trend. So in 2019 specifically, research showed that approximately 1 in 5, or about 19% of youth, reported seriously considering attempting suicide in the past year. And so that's reporting having suicide thoughts. And 1 in 6, or about 16%, reported making a suicide plan in the past year. And about 1 in 11, or about 9%, reported a past year suicide attempt. And again, this was in 2019, which is the last available national data. And these data come from the YRBS. The 2021 YRBS data should be coming out this summer. So we'll see some updated numbers this summer. A main imperative for adolescent suicide research remains identifying factors associated with the transition from suicide ideation to suicide attempts. So in other words, what distinguishes adolescents with suicide thoughts only from those who act on those thoughts or from those who attempt suicide? And this is really important because suicide attempts are a very, very strong predictor of eventual suicide death. But many gaps prevent the full exploration of that question. So on the slide here, I've highlighted some of the gaps, and the studies that I'll present today attempt to fill in some of those gaps. So first, the question that I just presented has been primarily explored with adult samples. And second, research with adolescent samples has primarily relied on small and racially homogeneous samples, and also samples drawn from clinics. So generalizability is really limited, and the use of population-based data like we used for the studies today really helps to address that concern. Also, third, a lot of adolescent suicide research collapses youth with any level of suicidality into one group and then compares them to non-suicidal youth. And that's a problem because then it leads to the broad categorization of suicide behavior correlates that aren't really specific to the type of suicide behavior experience. So lumping everyone together minimizes our ability to create interventions that target different levels of severity of those suicide behaviors. And so the second study that I'll present today focuses on capability. And capability, or suicide capability, is one specific factor that theory narrows in on as potentially differentiating those who only think about suicide from those who attempt suicide or act on those suicide thoughts. And so, like I said, the second study will focus specifically on the role of capability. Capability essentially describes overcoming the fear and pain associated with suicide through someone's repeated exposures to painful and provocative events. And so while theory understands the role of capability as essential in the progression from suicide ideation to attempt, it's not really well understood among adolescents. Most studies end up using a proxy for capability. So they use past suicide attempts, for example, as a proxy, rather than those actual exposures to painful and provocative experiences to measure that construct. And indicators of capability are often modeled as correlates of suicide attempts rather than a factor that moderates the relationship to suicide between suicide ideation and attempts, which is actually what's closer to the theoretical model. So both studies that I'll present today attempt to understand the research question through the lens of ideation to action frameworks of suicide. I think in a lot of articles that you see in public health journals or that use large population-based data sets, you don't always see the use of theory, but we were trying to have a theory-driven approach and kind of step outside of just using some chi-square analyses or logistic regression analyses. So for study one, we used the framework to try to improve suicide assessments. And again, I'll just reiterate that most studies often collapse youth with suicide thoughts, plans, and attempts together. And then that this is a problem because then most known suicide risk factors are actually those that are associated with ideation, because we know that most youth there are more youth who think about suicide than those who attempt suicide. And the majority who think about suicide don't go transition to make an attempt. And ideation to action frameworks help us to explore those transitions from suicide thoughts to attempts. The second study was framed specifically by the interpersonal theory of suicide, which is an ideation to action framework. So briefly, this theory posits that to engage in a serious attempt, individuals must have both the desire to die plus the acquired capability to self-harm. And again, the acquired capability is essentially when someone overcomes the fear and pain associated with suicide through repeated exposures to painful and provocative events. And suicide capability is considered as essential for that progression from suicide ideation to an attempt. So study one, which I'll get to in a minute, aimed to examine demographics, psychosocial, and substance use factors associated with distinct patterns of past 12-month suicide thoughts, suicide plans, and suicide attempts among adolescents drawn from a nationally representative sample of US high school students. And that data set was the YRBS. And because we use structural equation modeling for study two, it's easier to kind of display our aims in picture form. So this study had three main aims. The first was to test a measurement model of suicide capability. And we used 7 indicators representing those items, which were exposures to painful and provocative experiences. The first 2 were items representing both access to weapons, so carrying any weapon or carrying a gun. So both access to weapons and kind of like an exposure to a provocative experience. And then we see any fighting, any sexual violence, physical dating violence, injection drug use, and also having a concussion. So those are experiences that we saw and literature shows as representative of painful and provocative experiences. The second goal was to examine the direct relationship between level of suicide ideation and attempted suicide. And you can see here that we have a 3-level indicator of suicide ideation. So adolescents who reported no ideation, single ideation, which is they either reported having suicide thoughts or plans, and then dual ideation. And this is to represent an increasing severity in the level of the adolescent's ideation. And the third goal was to examine suicide capability as a moderator of the relationship. So does it strengthen or weaken the relationship between suicide ideation and attempted suicide? So I'll talk about the methods for each study individually, but overall the data came from 2015, 17, and 19 national YRBS. So the YRBS is conducted either at a national level or they have state level YRBS and even county level YRBS. It's a surveillance system throughout the United States. The CDC has developed and conducted the YRBS every other year since 1991. And the sampling procedures that they use essentially identify a representative sample of 9th through 12th graders in both public and private high schools in the 50 states and also DC. So it's a 3-stage cluster sampling design where the first stage of sampling represents counties. The second stage consists of sampling physical schools that have both 9th through 12th grade. And the third stage consists of a random sample of 1 or 2 classrooms within those schools where all of the students are eligible to participate. The CDC oversamples Black and Latinx students. And here on the screen, you'll see both the response rates as well as the final samples across the years, but just for timing purposes, I won't read these. Those are available on the CDC websites. So specifically for study 1, we pooled data from 2015, 17, and 19. The study was restricted specifically to students who reported suicide thoughts and a plan or an attempt within the past 12 months. So all adolescents had some level of suicidality, and this was to avoid having those comparisons to non-suicidal youth. And instead make distinctions between each other. So what factors distinguish, for example, youth who only think about suicide and youth who attempt suicide? And the data analytics sample consisted of 7,491 adolescents. I'm not going to go too in depth into our measures. Most are pretty straightforward and also publicly available on the CDC website, but I will go over how we created our patterns. So first we identified those suicide indicators provided by the CDC, and using those questions, the adolescents were categorized into 4 mutually exclusive groups representing distinct patterns of their past 12-month suicide behaviors, or briefly what we called suicide behavior patterns. So here we see that pattern 1 represented adolescents with suicide thoughts only. Pattern 2, where adolescents who reported suicide thoughts and plans without an attempt. Pattern 3 represented a suicide attempt with ideation. So here adolescents endorsed suicide thoughts and or plans and also an attempt. And pattern 4 was a suicide attempt without ideation. So here adolescents did not endorse either a suicide thoughts or plans. However, they did endorse a suicide attempt. And limited research exists for that 4th group of adolescents, but recent post-mortem analyses have shown that up to 30% of suicide deaths among youth occur seemingly without warning. For example, no history of or expression of suicide ideation. And those numbers are from a 2020 article by Rodway and colleagues from the Journal of Affective Disorders. So we thought it was a pretty important group to include within our study. So these are the specific items used for the psychosocial and substance use correlates, but again, all of those measures are available either in our study, which is published in Prevention Science, or found on the CDC website. So I will not go too deeply into those. Analyses were conducted in Stata, and weights calculated by the CDC were applied. We used unweighted frequencies and weighted percentages for the demographic, psychosocial, and substance use characteristics. And we also looked at differences in the factors across the 4 different adolescent suicide behaviors patterns using chi-square tests. So we used next 2 different series of multinomial logistic regression analyses to examine factors associated with those distinct patterns of 12-month suicide thoughts, plans, and attempts. So the first was multinomial logistic regression was used to estimate the degree to which each of those factors was independently associated with suicide behavior patterns. And then next, given the likelihood for concurrent experiences of the measured psychosocial and substance use factors among adolescents, for example, the possibility for overlapping sadness and hopelessness and alcohol use. We used a multivariable model to test all of the variables simultaneously, adjusting for demographic characteristics. So of the 7,491 youth who indicated some level of suicidality, we see that about a quarter represented pattern 1, suicide thoughts only. 38% reported pattern 2, suicide thoughts and plans without an attempt. Close to 35% reported pattern 3, a suicide attempt with ideation, and about 3% reported pattern 4. So they also reported a suicide attempt, but those youth did not report ideation with their attempt. In chi-square analyses, this 4th pattern was overrepresented by male respondents. And although Black youth only made up about 10% of the entire sample, they represented about 26% of youth who attempted suicide without ideation. We also see that 32% of respondents within pattern 4 reported feeling sad and hopeless, whereas respondents reporting all other patterns endorsed those feelings at much higher rates. Okay, so these represent some of the findings of that those first regression tests where individual factors were identified, but I'm only going to review some of the demographic correlates because there were a lot of significant findings in the individual regression runs, and I think considering overlapping psychosocial and substance use factors in the multivariable model is a little bit more interesting. I created these little pop-ups so you don't have to look at this like really intense table, and hopefully it provides a more boiled down view of these results, especially because I think multinomial logistic regression can kind of get a little tricky to to interpret. So first, we see here that relative to female youth, the male respondents had lower odds of suicide attempts with ideation, so pattern 3, than all of the ideation patterns. So that's pattern 1, suicide thoughts only, and pattern 2 of suicide thoughts and plans only. However, we also see that relative to females, males had greater odds or higher odds of suicide attempts without ideation than these ideation only patterns, and also suicide attempts with ideation. So moving on, we also found that compared to white youth, Black youth were at higher odds for attempted suicide with and without suicide ideation compared to ideation only patterns. And we also found that compared to white youth, Black youth had higher odds of a suicide attempt without reported ideation than a suicide attempt with ideation. So these are all the results from the multivariable model. Again, variables were entered into the model simultaneously to represent the possibility of concurrent psychosocial and substance use factors experienced by adolescents. And I'm just showing all the results here to avoid any sort of like reporting bias, but I'll zero in on some key results. So this is the top half of the chart previously shown. Here, when all of the variables were entered simultaneously, we see that relative to female youth, male youth still reported higher odds of attempted suicide without reported suicide ideation compared to all other suicide patterns. And among Black youth, some of similar patterns were still observed in the multivariable models, with higher risks for patterns 3 and 4 than ideation only patterns. Okay, so let's move on to talk about those psychosocial and substance use factors. I'm not going to talk about all of the significant results here, but just point out some of the things that we thought were interesting or consistent across results. First, we saw that those who reported feeling sad or hopeless had higher odds for attempted suicide rather than ideation only patterns, but lower odds for attempted suicide without ideation than all other suicide behavior patterns. Youth who reported lifetime history of sexual violence consistently had higher odds of attempts with ideation compared to ideation only patterns, which is compared to pattern 1, which is suicide thoughts only, and compared to pattern 2, which is suicide thoughts and plans only. Here we can see multiple significant substance use correlates, again, when compared, when modeled simultaneously, but I'll just focus on a few consistent patterns. Overall, we see that adolescents who reported cigarette, cannabis, illicit substance use, and prescription opiate misuse were at greater risk for suicide attempts, either with or without ideation-only patterns. Specific consistencies showed that both cigarette and cannabis use were associated with greater odds of attempted suicide with and without ideation than pattern 2, which represents reporting suicide thoughts and plans only. And the adolescents who reported using illicit substances and misusing prescription opiates were at greater odds for attempted suicide with ideation rather than suicide thoughts only, which is pattern 1. So I'll revisit some of these findings later, but I'm going to shift to the next study. So I'll just quickly remind you of what we were aiming to do in that study, which was to test the measurement model of suicide capability, to examine that direct relationship between level of suicide ideation and attempted suicide, and to examine suicide capability as a moderator between level of suicide ideation and attempted suicide. To see if the relationship between level of suicide ideation and attempted suicide varied as a function of level of suicide capability. So data from the study again came from YRBS, specifically 2017 and 19, and we included all adolescents with a final data analytic sample of 28,422. Again, I won't go too in depth on measures here, but I'll talk about the creation of our 3-level suicide ideation variable. So here we used the suicide ideation indicators to create a 3-level measure for suicide ideation which is a strategy consistent with weighing ideation items in some scales to include planning at the highest level of severity. So at the first level, we have adolescents with no reported ideation. They aren't reporting suicide thoughts or plans in response to the ideation indicators. At the second level is single ideation, where adolescents are reporting either thoughts or plans. And at the third level is dual ideation, where adolescents are reporting both thoughts and plans. And this slide shows the indicators for suicide capability. Again, all of these measures are available on the YRBS website. And this paper will be out soon in suicide and life-threatening behaviors. So preliminary analyses here were conducted again in Stata, and we applied weights. We also used unweighted frequencies and weighted percentages, and we looked at a chi-square to examine differences in characteristics of those adolescents across either reporting or not reporting attempted suicide. Next, data were analyzed in N+. Confirmatory factor analysis was initially applied with those 7 indicators representing suicide capability. And I could actually probably talk for an hour itself on the modeling complications for this analysis and the fit procedures we had to follow since traditional fit statistics weren't produced, but I'll be short. And if you're truly interested in that, you can contact me for more specifics. So although binary indicators and outcomes were tested in the measurement model and also the structural model, data were modeled using MLR because it's the only estimator available for testing latent variable interactions with XWidth command. And we also declared all of the binary outcomes and indicators as categorical R. So that created a lot of different complications. So 2 latent variable interactions were created, and also the weighting created a lot of different complications as well. So 2 latent variable interactions were created using the XWidth command. Those interaction terms were included in relevant linear equations with the reference categories excluded from those linear equations. So when MLR was employed with the categorical R option, we obtained logic coefficients and we transformed them into odds ratios. And for the interaction figure that I'll show, we transform them again into percentages. So super briefly, before I go into the measurement model, about 9% and 6% of the sample reported single ideation and dual ideation respectively. And our chi-square test showed that of adolescents who attempted suicide, a majority endorsed dual ideation, while 15.9% with an attempt only reported single ideation, and 7.9% reported no ideation. So these are the results from our measurement model of capability. Here we see the loading factors for the finer measurement model. Again, I really won't talk about the fit. It was pretty complicated, but we used our Tech 10 output, which indicated that we needed to add some residual covariances, which you can see on the screen here. And we did this by using the by option. So results showed that compared to respondents with no reported ideation, that those reporting single and dual ideation experienced increased odds of attempted suicide, controlling for both psychosocial and demographic factors, and that the relationship between level of suicide ideation and attempted suicide significantly varied as a function of one's level of suicide capability. And so we did a simple slopes analysis to test the estimation for each level of suicide ideation at different levels of our moderator suicide capability. So to simplify, like I said, to simplify the interpretation, we transformed these into percentages. So although adolescents reporting dual ideation have the highest rates of attempted suicide at each level of suicide capability, we see here that the rates of attempted suicide escalate more rapidly among adolescents with no reported ideation and single ideation with increasing levels of suicide capability. So for example, when we're examining attempted suicide among adolescents reporting single ideation, we can see that the percentages almost doubles comparing adolescents with single ideation at mean level of capability and adolescents with single ideation at 1 standard deviation above the mean level of capability. And then it does double when comparing 1 standard deviation and 2 standard deviation levels. But this increase is less steep when we're moving from the 43% to the 60% to the 76% for adolescents reporting dual ideation. So you can see that gray bar there, that increase is less steep. So we can also see a rapid rate of change is present for adolescents with no reported ideation. However, we know that that base occurrence rate for attempted suicide among those adolescents with no ideation is much lower, indicating that it would take really high levels of capability for adolescents with no reported ideation to equate those same odds for attempted suicide as adolescents with single ideation or dual ideation at even lower levels of capability. So here we see, for example, that 8.17% of adolescents with single ideation at the mean level of capability reported attempted suicide versus 6.43% of adolescents with no reported ideation at 2 standard deviations above the mean level of capability reporting attempted suicide. Okay, so what does it all mean? So instead of talking about each individual result and the literature related to it, I want to talk more broadly about how all of these results fit together and what they mean specifically for suicide assessments. I want to bring focus specifically to assessments because there's just like a ton of discussion points and implications across the papers, and I think it's a common strand across both papers. So one of the more interesting groups that we saw in both papers were these groups who attempted suicide, even though what we know to be common suicide precursors were either not present or were not reported. So namely suicide thoughts and plans. In the first paper, that would be pattern 4. And in the second paper, that would be focusing on the fact that capability more rapidly escalated the risk for suicide attempts among those with single ideation or even no reported ideation. And ultimately, we want to think about what those results mean in the context of screening and assessments. So I'll start with some findings from the first study that have been part of a larger conversation around Black youth suicide led by 2 of my co-authors, Drs. Michael Lindsay and Ariel Sheftal, and weave in some of the newer findings as well. So the pictures on the screen are from 2 articles from the New York Times and Scientific American that study 1 was cited in, and again, the co-authors Lindsay and Sheftal have led the conversation within these articles. So like I said, some of the findings were really focused on trying to think about how to help that 4th group of adolescents, the group who reported a suicide attempt without reporting ideation, a group who might be overlooked traditionally. And I keep saying reporting ideation here because rather than ideation was absent, because of the structure of the survey, it's hard to know if these youth truly didn't experience ideation or if the questions didn't resonate with these youth and therefore these ideation questions weren't endorsed because ideation might manifest differently. And we tend to think the latter. So thinking about pattern 4, Black adolescents were overrepresented in this group, reporting suicide attempts without reported ideation. When we think about that classic definition of suicide ideation, which is the consideration or desire to end one's life, this might not align with the experiences of Black youth, and it's likely that these youth are experiencing symptoms and warning signs that we aren't recognizing or picking up on because we often look to expression of suicide thoughts or plans or an appearance of depression or classic depression to cue us to intervene. We don't automatically think of different types of expressions, such as relationship problems, externalizing behaviors, or physical complaints as connected to imminent risk of suicide. However, these factors should be considered as concerning, and particularly for Black adolescents. In fact, some of those factors were found as precipitating circumstances of suicide death among Black adolescents in a new article in JCAP by one of my co-authors, Dr. Sheftal. And her work discusses two specific relationship problems among Black girls specifically that can precipitate suicide death. So in her study, Black girls were more likely to experience a partner crisis prior to death and also died by suicide within 24 hours of an argument compared to Black boys. And so linking in our second study, we can think about some of our capability indicators as similarly aligned to these factors. Adolescents who reported suicide attempts without reported ideation were also less likely to report feeling sad or hopeless. These feelings are key diagnostic criteria of depression, and we often automatically connect suicide with depression or sadness and hopelessness. But these results show that this connection might not always exist, and something else could be going on with these youth. These youth might be experiencing other non-depressive mental health disorders that are also associated with suicide behaviors. And again, since Black adolescents were overrepresented in pattern 4, we should think about exposure to interpersonal racial discrimination and systemic racism and links to trauma. And again, differential expressions of depression that don't necessitate endorsing feelings of sadness or hopelessness. So research on the CESD, which is a depression measure by Michael Lindsay, showed that Black youth endorse somatic complaints and relational concerns as primary indicators of depression rather than affect-related symptoms like sadness and hopelessness. So this brings back the capability study, and those results further emphasized a need to assess factors outside of traditional suicide precursors, such as a history of physical fights, sexual violence, and even concussions as they strengthen suicide risk. And yes, we know that those indicators are generally correlates of suicide, but when we're working in the field, we have to think about if we would actually strongly consider them for someone who indicated that they didn't have suicide thoughts or plans as part of our initial suicide screen. And yet the study showed that they may actually be more influential on outcomes among youth without reported ideation or with only single ideation. So what does it mean for nuanced suicide assessments? And some of this might seem like a reiteration of what I've said, but I think that's okay because assessments need to change. First, the studies raise awareness that suicide attempts can occur without that classical presentation or typical assumed warning signs of suicide thoughts and plans. An expression of suicidality can exist outside of those ideations. So suicide screenings often mark suicide thoughts and plans as those primary indicators that a person might be at risk for an attempt, but youth might express symptoms or show warning signs in different ways. And our results show that youth might not report their thoughts and plans, but still be at risk for an attempt. Second, it's important to expand questions, the questions we ask, and what we might consider as a risk factor during suicide assessments. For example, clinicians should not only collect information related to sexual abuse history, substance use, and capability factors, but then make that connection between those factors and the potential for an increased risk for attempted suicide, including for those who indicate no ideation, or especially for those who indicate no ideation. And finally, I think that trust and rapport are essential during suicide assessments, but also just the knowledge and breadth and experiences of the full context of someone who's sitting in front of you. And having that context is really especially important when the youth in front of you might be presenting with differential symptom expressions or warning signs besides what we are automatically looking for, aside from suicide thoughts and plans, so that we have a full awareness of the potential for risk. Like I mentioned, there's just so many implications from these studies, but I think for timing purposes, I will stop there and look forward to any more questions that you either have today or if something comes up after you read the studies. I have my contact information on the final slide. Just before I end, I'd like to thank the members of the lab at McSilver, many of whom were co-authors on these papers. The co-authors are starred here. as well as on the final bullet point. I'd like to thank CSDE for the invitation and you all for being here. And I look forward to your questions.
So thank you, Megan. So please enter your questions in the Q&A, and then we'll answer them one by one as they come in. So sorry, dealing with the kid thing. Yeah, I mean, so if there aren't any questions, you have her, Megan's.
I do see a question about, have you looked at how COVID has affected these trends? Interesting. So the new wire, I have not personally. Some of my research actually is around LGBTQ youth suicide, and there has been some research in that area about kind of like being more stressed in that, having an influence on increased kind of like mental health outcomes, but maybe not necessarily the trends in suicide. But this new YRBS data set coming out over the summer did incorporate questions around COVID. If you go onto the YRBS website right now, you can access the questionnaire, so you can see the types of questions that they did ask around COVID. So I believe that those types of questions will be in the new iterations of the YRBS analyses. We'll be looking at COVID impacts on both kind of like suicide trends as well as other risk behaviors. So the YRBS is the Youth Risk Behavior Survey or surveillance system. And so I'm sure that the new iteration of looking at trends of youth behaviors are definitely going to consider how the COVID impacts for sure.
So I just have a dumb question. Are suicide rates higher for during COVID than in previous years?
So I think that data is still coming out. And like I said, the new batch of YRBS data, which is kind of like the population-based data for youth, that is what we use, the CDC data, will come out this summer, and that's what's going to tell us what's been happening in terms of trends.
So we have another question from Isaiah Wright. What information is missing within the data that you wish you could incorporate in order to progress your findings?
Yeah, so there's a lot of, specifically this data set, there's a lot of things missing. A lot of things missing actually. So this is cross-sectional data. So that's one big thing within this research question that's missing. So these profiles are specifically built off of past 12-month information. And it would be, I guess, a more robust analysis to be able to look at someone's full history. So what happened throughout their lifetime. And to follow people through. I mean, there's other data sets where you might be able to do that. For example, looking at AdHealth would be a good idea, although AdHealth looks at youth starting in like 1997. So something more contemporary would be would be helpful. The YRBS also, like I said, focuses on behaviors. So we're really missing a lot of social context when we are using the YRBS data set. So we're missing information about youth's peer context. We're missing information about youth's parental context. So when we rely on the YRBS, which is great because it is population-based data, we are missing a lot because they ask a lot of questions about, it's a behavior survey. We're missing those social contexts.
So do you just want to read it? I think you can see the question. So if you
just,
okay.
Yes, I see. Mischievous responders. Interesting. So when we were so great use of the YRBS data. Have you thought about mischievous responders to certain YRBS questions and how this could have affected your results? Yeah, really interesting. We thought about that a lot, actually, specifically around our second paper when we were going back and forth with the editors for suicide and life-threatening behavior. There's a lot of questions around, like, are adolescents really not attempting suicide without reporting thoughts and plans? Like, is that a real group of adolescents? And we really maintain that that is a group of adolescents, and we are trying to frame the study that we don't think that these are a group of adolescents who are just impulsively attempting suicide. We think that these are adolescents who for some reason just like aren't, the questions aren't resonating with them, or they just aren't reporting their ideations. But we don't think that there's an absence of ideation. We think that there is ideation that might be manifesting differently. And we were able to make the case for that. And it's actually, once the paper comes out there, we had to write that case throughout that second paper. But those questions, the ideation plan, or thought plan and attempt questions, have been tested pretty thoroughly by Klonsky, I believe. He did a lot of tests so that those questions are pretty reliable. But yes, we thought about mischievous responders pretty strongly. And it was interesting because Klonsky is the editor of that journal. And so we were talking to him about the questions.
Useful when the journal editor knows your data, right? Well, if there are no more questions, thank you, Megan, for giving a fantastic talk. Everyone has your contact information, and which is good. As a reminder, we will not be having a seminar next week. Instead, we'll meet in 2 weeks when Ali Sewell will be giving a talk about her work. So thank you for coming, and see you in 2 weeks.